Hello, and welcome to One World, One Health, where we chat with people working to solve some of the biggest problems facing our world. I'm Maggie Fox. This podcast is brought to you by the One Health Trust, with bite-sized insights into ways to help address challenges such as infectious diseases, climate change, and pollution. A One Health approach recognizes that we're all connected: animals, plants and people, and the climate and environment. You can't find a better example of these connections than bird flu. H5N1 avian influenza has spread completely around the world in recent years, moving from birds to a range of species, including foxes, cats, and cattle. It's infected at least 70 people in the U.S. and killed at least one, and the damage to poultry has helped drive up the price of eggs. This virus hasn't proven especially deadly among people yet, and it doesn't seem to spread from person to person, but it's changing, mutating, so that it can infect mammals more easily. Dr. Marcela Uhart is keeping an eye on all of this. Dr. Uhart is director of the Latin America program at the University of California, Davis. She studies wild animals, especially marine wildlife, in Latin America. She and colleagues recently investigated a huge outbreak of H5N1 that killed more than 17,000 elephant seals in Argentina. Dr. Uhart is joining us to talk about what she found and what it means for all of us. Dr. Uhart, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me. My pleasure.
You found evidence that elephant seals, sea lions, and other marine mammals are spreading H5N1 to one another. Can you tell us a little bit about what you found?
Yes, so that was actually a surprise. We were suspicious that that was the case because the outbreak had been spreading across many countries in South America, including from north to south on the Pacific coastline, and then from south to north on the Atlantic coastline of South America. And when we were able to get our hands on samples from the animals that were dying during this outbreak, we were able to confirm that was effectively the case, that the virus that we were finding in individual marine mammals, individual elephant seals and sea lions was identical, suggesting that the virus was going from one to the other. And also just how massive the outbreaks were, over a few days only. There's no way that individual events that we call spillovers. So when a bird virus goes individually to one single mammal, that could not happen, to 18,000 animals individually each time. That is highly unlikely.
People usually think of influenza as a respiratory virus, but among birds, it's spread by bird droppings. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So the reservoirs of this type of influenza viruses in nature are wild birds, specifically waterfowl. And waterfowl live in water environments. So an efficient way for them to spread the virus is through feces, and then the virus stays viable in the water, and then it gets ingested by others, and that's how there's exposure for many individuals next to them. And also there's an issue with their receptors by which they get infected. So how that virus binds to the body and causes infection. So their system is prepared for an infection that runs through the gut mostly, through the digestive tract. So that's why this fecal transmission makes sense for them. Conversely, for humans, we have specific receptors for influenza viruses in our respiratory tract, and we tend to interact with one another by being in closer proximity. And that is why we get efficient transmission of any flu virus, right, that we know of through respiratory droplets, the coughing, the sneezing, etc.
And by receptors, I just want to make clear, these are structures on your cells, on your individual cells, where the virus kind of docks and can infect the cell.
Exactly. It's like a key to lock system, right? So it's just a mechanism by which the virus can actually infect us in any species. And it's just a difference there. And, the risk here is that over time, the virus may evolve. That's what it's trying to do, is to find mechanisms to be able to adapt to these other receptors, right? And then become infective by other means that are more efficient. And it may be, we don't know yet, that there was some of that already in the transmission between individual marine mammals. It is unlikely that fecal transmission was the most likely route of infection for these species as well. So there may be some of that happening.
So that's what I want to ask you because we're talking about the birds spreading it and the virus persists in the water. How did the virus get from birds to sea mammals? Was it floating around in the water?
The virus doesn't live very long in seawater, right? That is not a good environment for it. Fresh water is much better. But, it can still survive a little bit. So there is a possibility that some of that was the case. It could be close interactions with birds, of course, to get that initial transmission. But then also what we have to think of that is that when these marine mammals are on land, which is rare, especially for elephant seals who spend 90% of their life in the deep ocean, when they're on land, they're very, very closely aggregated. They live in very dense aggregations, one on top of the other. They interact with each other all the time. This happened during the breeding season, so there's a lot of fighting and very close contact. So there's also a very high potential for respiratory or even saliva transmission. And we saw lots of interactions including between species. So like between sea lions and elephant seals, where they could have been biting and other ways of close contact and transmission. But that still remains to be, better understood.
So there's a poorly understood situation where at some point a bird infected a seal and then the seal started infecting one another.
Yeah, so that actually happened early on from what we know. When the virus arrived in South America, it arrived in Peru, this particular strain, and it actually did make several jumps into marine mammals. And we have those documented, but those were dead ends. They did a one individual bird to mammal jump and it stayed there. And then one of these viruses had enough mutations in it that it was actually able to catch on in the marine mammals. So the virus that we saw in Argentina with the elephant seals had already been spreading through Peru, through Chile, and finally came to Argentina with that capacity already to be transmissible between mammals. And then it continued on further north to Uruguay and Brazil along the coast of the Atlantic in South America. So it spread across at least 5 countries already efficiently within marine mammals themselves.
And I'm interested in the mother to cub transmission. Does this tell us anything about milk carrying the virus?
Yeah, that is the $1,000,000 question. So, of course, when we investigated this outbreak, we did not know that cows were going to become infected and that milk was going to be such an important thing. We're thinking again, your first question was it is usually transmitted in birds by feces and in humans by aerosols and respiratory. And then we come to this milk situation, which you had never seen for an influenza virus before, right? So this was completely out of the blue. It caught us off guard with the cows. And then, well, retrospectively, I wish we could have we would have thought about that, especially because with elephant seals, babies were dramatically affected. That was the group that was most affected and died. So it is potentially possible that mothers were infected and then gave the virus to their pups through milk and nursing. Should a second outbreak occur, we will definitely sample the milk to see if that is happening. But at that time, we did not know. What we did see, however, is some species like sea lions were having abortions. So they were aborting their fetuses before term, and those fetuses were loaded with virus. So at least there's some potential also for some transmission during gestation. So it could be that the unborn pups were already infected in utero and could have been, born already infected, and then they developed the disease very rapidly. So all of that is up in the air. We still don't know.
Something to keep an eye on as the virus moves into more species of animals and potentially into people.
Absolutely. Yes. Mammals have all these interesting additions to the equation that we don't normally think of with avian influenza.
You have called this latest global outbreak, this zoonotic, a global stress test. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, so that is a common term that we use when we prepare for disease outbreaks or for pandemics, etc. So when we prepare for these big events, we kind of test how well our systems for responding are. So are we prepared for response to a massive outbreak? Are we prepared for a response to the first evidence of efficient human-to-human transmission when there's a cluster that we detect? So this is what it means, this stress testing. Is our surveillance up to speed? Are we, and then if we do detect it, are we ready to prepare rapidly? Would we be able to hit the ground running? So do we have a vaccine in the pipeline that we could potentially, pull out really quickly? And things that particularly now are very relevant because we very recently went through a very traumatic experience with COVID. So we would assume that we learned something from that and that this time we wouldn't be caught off guard. We, in these health scenarios, call these intervals between outbreaks peacetime. So this is when it's quiet. And then this is when we have to make sure that we are prepared if something changes very dramatically, because usually the changes happen like very quickly, right?
So, what you're doing is a part of the puzzle, but why should anyone study elephant seals all the way down in the southern hemisphere? What's that got to do with the rest of the world?
I would say that we study elephant seals because we love them and they're crucially important to the ecosystems on the ocean, and conservation of wildlife and ecosystems is critical for all of us on the planet, right? But beyond that, for this particular disease, what we can learn from what happens in wildlife is crucial, right? This is a virus that mostly moves around the wildlife sector in this piece of the puzzle. So that is where these viruses evolve and where they may be changing faster than we can detect it in the domestic animals or in humans. So there's a key role here in what we call in surveillance. So it is extremely relevant that we continue to look at what's happening in wildlife, because beyond the elephant seals themselves, the virus is moving through other wildlife populations. And in each one of these, it is evolving and adapting and acquiring new characteristics. So, for example, the new genotype D1.1 that is now proven to be deadly to humans multiple times. So it caused the human case in Louisiana, it caused the human case in Mexico recently, and it almost killed a person in Canada. That new genotype now is also infecting cows, the dairy cows, right? So what does that mean? And the only way we've known of this is because we're doing this kind of surveillance in the wildlife itself. And that's where we need to look, because we can control how people move to some extent. We can control how domestic animals move or they behave to some extent because we're growing them for food. But the wildlife they can do whatever they wish. They go free roaming around the world, that they could easily carry these more dangerous genotypes to other countries, to other regions, etc., and allow the virus to become something bigger than what it is now. The B3.2 genotype that we have in South America has been extinct in North America for over a year now. It's no longer circulating here anymore. So already just in the Americas, we see two very distinct evolutionary pathways, right? They're not even related anymore. And then this D1.1 has emerged, and now it's taking over these B genotypes that were prevalent before that. And this is what this virus is trying to do. If you're a virus that cannot have an independent life outside of a host, you need to find ways that you evolve and that you maintain yourself, hopefully not actually killing your host. You just want to be more transmissible. So that's kind of where this play of evolution is happening, where the virus is probably trying to find ways that it can sustain infection within mammals or any other species, not necessarily killing everybody, but definitely becoming more efficient in this process. So one of the most intriguing mechanisms by which this happens is one sort of transformation of their genes, which is reassortment, right? Which is when one single individual gets infected with two different viruses at the same time, and those two viruses exchange pieces of the genetic material. So actually the virus that caused the outbreak in South America, it stems from a genotype that emerged in North America from the combination of the virus that arrived from Europe with gene pool from viruses that were endemic in North America. That created a new virus that is the one that then migrated and caused this mass mortality in marine mammals. So we've seen this at play like so often within the last 3 years. It's just pretty amazing how rapidly these changes can happen.
And of course, people struggle to understand this because there is this concept that the viruses don't want to kill their hosts, because then that means the viruses die. But there's an intermediate period where, the viruses don't consciously know what they're doing. They just mutate sporadically, and there's no rhyme or reason to it. And they could mutate into a form that's both transmissible and deadly. How might people be contributing to this spread among animals?
particularly with the domestic animals, we are, I would say, almost entirely responsible for how the virus is spreading, right? So in poultry, of course, it relates to the biosecurity of those farms. So that means how well they maintain their flock separated from any, wild birds outside of there, but also how the people working within those facilities is protected. And then also how we make sure that people working in one facility don't carry the virus inadvertently in their clothes, their shoes, or etc., to another farm where those same people work. And a little bit of that is what seems to have happened in the dairy cow industry, where people not only move from one farm to the other and potentially they are carrying the virus, but also that we move the cows from one place to the other and then have been moving the virus without knowing from one location to the next. So we've been responsible for a lot of the transmission within the domestic animal. With wildlife, it's a little bit more complex, obviously, because we don't decide where, waterfowl go and when, etc. But we do often create ideal situations for them to be exposed. So, for example, around poultry farms or dairy farms, there are often little ponds, little creeks that, so the waterfowl tend to come there because their wetlands are gone. So that this is the one few places that they have. And then, of course, in the farms themselves, there's feed. So, there's waste that is spilled out or whatever, and the birds can actually go there and forage. And that there's everything their need is right there. It's like going to the supermarket for them. So then that makes it ideal for them to want to come to these sites more. So we create the conditions that are good for them. And then sometimes when we get scared about that, then has happened where we create noise or we go and shoot and something like that scares the birds away. So that means that if anybody was infected, then they're taking that infection to other places. And we're again responsible for that transmission just by shooing the birds away and just sending the problem to another location.
What's all this mean for conservation as well? Can H5N1 drive a species out of existence or put it on the edge?
Yes, it can. I mean, it's showing us that it can actually. So, for example, one of the species that was most hit in South America were Peruvian pelicans. That was already an endangered species. After the massive outbreak that wiped out more than 60% of its entire population in the first outbreak in 2022 and 23, this species was listed as critically endangered. And now, after skipping a year because there was nobody left, they have tried to sit down and breed again. And again, they have been hit by an outbreak. So it is very likely that this species is going to go into some very severe issues going forward if anybody does survive. Hopefully there's enough animals that haven't been exposed or that have been exposed and survived so that they're immune and carry on this, but they're going to be left on the edge. And the other example I'll give you is the case of the elephant seals that from our monitoring for over 30 years in the area where this outbreak occurred, we know that the population was actually increasing. It was a conservation success story. So in conservation, we call those least concern, right? These are the animals that are doing okay, despite other things like, climate change and interactions with fisheries that are added threats. But what we saw from this massive outbreak, not only the mortality of all the pups in that one season, but what we are seeing now last year since we continue monitoring is that it appears that many adult breeding females were also killed. So that means that by our recent estimates, it'll be at least 70 years before this population is back on track to what it used to be in 2022 before avian influenza hit them. And it could be even longer than that. So 2,100 and something before the population is back to where it should have been naturally. And so this means that a population that was least concerned maybe now is vulnerable actually to extinction. So if we add all of these other things that, are coming at them at the same time, or that we'll have another outbreak of avian influenza next year or whenever the virus is now circulating very broadly, this could actually be very impactful for many species. And the virus is now in Antarctica. We may assume that is the continent where we should have the lowest footprint on the planet. and most of the species there are endemic to that region. That means they live there and nowhere else on the planet, and they play crucial roles in the ecosystems down there that then feed all the rest of our oceans, which regulate our climate. The oceans produce half of the oxygen that we breathe every day. So we think of the Amazon forest, but the ocean is just as critical. So, if we lose these functional ecosystems beyond the species themselves, we can all be in very big trouble, right? We wouldn't want to be there, but the situation now is of huge concern.
Dr. Uhart, thank you so much for taking the time to chat with us about this.
Thank you very much. This is really, really nice to do. Thanks.
Listeners, if you enjoyed this podcast, please share it. You can find links to this and other important topics at onehealthtrust.org. And let us know what else you'd like to hear about at OWOH@onehealthtrust.org. Thanks for listening.
Thank you for listening to One World, One Health, brought to you by the One Health Trust. I'm Ramanan Lakshminarayan, founder and president of the One Health Trust. You can subscribe to One World, One Health on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Follow us on social media at One Health Trust, one word, for updates on One World, One Health and the latest in research on One Health issues like drug resistance, disease spillovers, and the social determinants of health. Finally, please do consider donating to the One Health Trust to support this podcast and other initiatives and research that help us promote health and well-being worldwide. Until next time.